The first thing that comes to my mind when I hear the word salvation is the altar calls that I remember from my youth and childhood days. Evangelism through a worship service, a Christian concert, a Billy Graham crusade, a revival tent meeting. These would often end with an emotional plea that anyone who didn't know Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior should come forward, should pray a special prayer. And some people might associate this with the old Baptist hymn, "Just as I Am." Sometimes if the pastor didn't think enough people were coming forward, he might sing a few more verses of the hymn until that last person felt God tugging at their heart finally and answered that call forward. If you ever responded to an altar call or have at least seen someone do so, you might remember this as a special time in which hearts and minds were truly changed. But some of you might see it as a bit of emotional manipulation or being pressured, maybe like if you were dealing with a pushy used car salesman. But either way, you would definitely recognize the language used in these situations. This is often called being born again or being saved. Or if it wasn't your first time coming forward, you might call it rededicating your life to Jesus. A few years back at one of our mission trips, a few of our teenage girls came up to me. They had already been involved for a few days with their work crew, which always contains youth and adults from other churches across the country, and different denominations are represented in those. And in the devotional times that they had had together as a small group, some of the other kids were talking about when they had gotten saved, and may have even asked our girls if they were saved. My girls had no idea how to respond, and they began to fear that something had gone terribly wrong in their spiritual life thus far. And it was at that point that I realized that here at Evangelical, we don't really use that kind of language. We don't talk about being born again. We don't talk about getting saved. They knew baptism. They knew confirmation. That was their language. And they wondered which, if any, of that counted as being saved. I assured the girls that there was nothing to worry about and that different churches talk about things a little differently. I gave them a spontaneous version of what I'm about to say to you as well. For some, coming to a relationship with Jesus may be something that they can pinpoint to a specific moment in time, like a response to an invitation or an altar call. But for others, salvation through Christ may be more like a process or a journey, as we come to make little decisions that build on each other along the way. As we grow and learn more about Christ, we may look back and see what Methodist theologian John Wesley called prevenient grace, the grace that goes before us, God at work in our lives even before we are aware that it's going on. For me, I was baptized as an infant, and I like thinking back to what I'm sure was a meaningful time for others to recognize God's working in my life, knowing that someday I would know more about what that meant. We may also see salvation in terms of when God's justifying grace was made clear to us. One or several times when we made a conscious decision to follow God more closely, or to change parts of our life that distracted us from living the way God would want us to live. And now, or maybe in the future, we may see that our dedication and our devotion to being a true disciple or follower of Jesus is leading us toward His sanctifying grace, that which builds spiritual maturity within us as our faith deepens and our actions follow. I pulled these three grace concepts from the final chapter of Martin Thielen's book, What's the Least I Can Believe and Still Be a Christian? We've used this in our church before a few years ago. I really like how he describes salvation as a lifelong process, not just a one-time experience. He mentions that when Jesus calls people to himself, he didn't say, here are the 4 spiritual laws that you must believe, or here's a sinner's prayer that you must pray exactly like this. He simply said, "Follow me." Thielen also points to what Paul says in Philippians 2, "Continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." I would echo those words as well, encouraging you to make a decision or pray a prayer each and every day in an attempt to follow Jesus more closely than you did the day before. And within that, I would also encourage you to seek God's forgiveness for the times when you weren't quite up for the challenge.